So, beginning in 2011, the Syrian civil war has inflicted nearly a decade of constant violence on the citizens of Syria. Despite the original intentions behind the demonstrations against the ruler Bashar al-Assad and the ensuing chaos and instability was seen as an opportunity for different groups. Um, Alternative ambitions held by parties involved sometimes worked at cross purposes with the goal of actually ending the war. This nature of decision making, accompanied by the continued international involvement, makes the Syrian civil war an example of the failure of the international intervention, with no external player blameless for the situation. Between actors, agendas for what could be gained from the conflict abounded without any party's priority being ending the conflict over gaining what they individually wanted from the situation. So the Syrian civil war became so devastating because of the unique characteristics of the Syrian people and Bashar al-Assad himself, the participation of international actors, and the intervention of radical organizations, which split focus for all parties involved. So on March 6th in 2011, a group of young people were arrested in Daraa, a rural city in Syria. They were arrested for putting up graffiti that was anti-Assad and anti-regime in public. There are some debates as to whether or not this was teenagers in a school setting or young people in a public setting. Regardless, the reports agree that these youths were arrested and tortured extensively, with one of them dying as a result. So this sparked a protest in Daraa, which was responded to by the security forces in Daraa with extreme violence, and footage and images of security forces shooting into civilian populations were captured, and thanks to social media were published long before the regime could get a handle on the situation. So this spread into mass demonstrations across Syria, and resulted in multiple demonstrations that invited a more severe response from security forces and escalated into the civil war that we see today. So just an idea of the Syrian map and the layout. So Damascus is the city that houses the regime and the capital, and it was never taken. Aleppo and Idlib, which is nearby, are two of the hubs for the resistance and the opposition. Lebanon comes into play because there is a radical group that is based in Lebanon that is involved. And then there's Turkey and Iraq, Turkey was heavily involved, Iraq was marginally involved. So although each locality brought their own unique complaints to the demonstrations and the protests, there were three broad complaints that could be identified by specifically external viewers trying to understand what was going on. First is the concentration of power to a few elites where there was no room for a democratic voice or a voice of the Syrian people. Second was economic stress and high unemployment, especially high unemployment for younger people, which adds to the stress of radicalization and kind of trying to keep moderates from radicalizing. That doesn't help. And this blame was placed on the state because it is a state-controlled market, rather than on firms or the wealthy. It was more, we know that the state is responsible for this economic burden. Finally, there was this complaint of a majority Sunni population being ruled by an Alawite minority, which is a sect of Shia Islam. Assad's response to this was silence for the first few weeks, and then he erupted into this sectarian language that turned it into more of a religious war than it was initially, which led to a different shape of the conflict forming. He did make verbal concessions that were enough to appease some of the older generations, but not enough to appease the population as a whole. He said all of this alongside continuing to support and order physical attacks on any demonstrators, even the unarmed civilians. So the opposition is organized in a very chaotic way, which made it very difficult for Western media to understand it. So very simply put, the first organization to represent the opposition was the Syrian National Council that began in August 2011. It is important to note that these are not Syrians in Syria operating in concert with the militias. These are Syrians who had already moved out of Syria prior to the opposition, the uprising, who were operating out of Turkey and trying to communicate with the ground forces and the local militia. The second political organization and successor to the SNC is the SOC, or the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, in November in 2012. This was created to include international delegates such as Qatar and Saudi Arabian delegates, as well as delegates from the former SNC. This was more of an internationally controlled organization, again, with very little input from the actual local militias. Finally, there's the Free Syrian Army, which is more of a loose umbrella under which local militias united, not a description of a hierarchy or a military order, as you would expect to see in a state's military. There are several non-state actors. Many of these are labeled as jihadist or terrorist groups. First, there's Jabhat al-Nusra. This is on the side of the opposition. It is important to note that they are distinct from the Islamic State, despite claims from the Islamic State's founder, Abu Bakr Baghdadi. There's Ahrar al-Sham, which is also on the side of the opposition. They are a different type of Islamic extremist. They are Salafist, which is a fundamental Islamic extremism group. There's Hezbollah, which is the Lebanese militia, which supported the regime. And then finally, there are Kurdish militant groups, which are supporting the opposition, but it's important to note that they have an ulterior motive of cultural autonomy, which they have been traditionally stripped of. Kurdish involvement also complicates things with Turkey, since there is a long-standing animosity between many Kurdish militia groups and Turkish government. So this is how it all lays out, with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, the United States, and the EU, and the West in general on the side of the opposition, with non-state actors Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, and Kurdish separatist groups. Supporting the regime, there's Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah. And while this seems out of balance, it's important to note that Iran and Russia were the most consistent actors, while Saudi Arabia and Qatar left in the mid-2010s. Turkey persisted in their support. The United States left around 2017. And then the militant groups that were non-state actors were less well-funded and less organized than Iran and Russia. So for the first argument that Syria and Bashar are different than the other states in the Arab Spring, first, there was reason for populations and large swaths of the population to support Assad. First among them is economic reform that Bashar al-Assad initiated. There was benefits in this reform that affected the urban middle class, specifically at the expense of the rural middle class, which added to the socioeconomic imbalance between those two regions. Second, there were tribal alliances where Assad had previously supported certain tribes active in Syria, and they now owed to him a certain level of allegiance. Third, Assad was seen as kind of an Arab counter to Western influence in the Middle East. So citizens of Syria and the Arab world who were reluctant to or resistant to Western influence in the Middle East would see Assad as this figure of like Arab nationalism and anti-Western sentiment, which for some was enough to override their discomfort with what he was doing domestically. Fourth, there is a position that Assad holds in the Arab world as a Shia leader. Since Alawite is a sect of Shia Islam, he is seen as a minority leader in a majority Sunni Islam world. And for that reason, many Shia Muslims who have suffered from prejudice or even persecution in Sunni majority nations might be tempted to support Bashar al-Assad despite what he's done to his own population, because there is kind of a trade-off and an anxiousness about allowing a Sunni Islam majority party to take over what Assad has built. And then finally, there's the aspect of stability. Those who might be more scared of a regime change than they are of what Bashar al-Assad is already doing would be more inclined to maybe not actively support, but tacitly support Assad, just because of the promise of a regime that has been in effect since the 1970s. So outside of the population the divide between the population between pro-Assad and anti-Assad sentiment, there are also the population of Syria is much less homogenous than you would see in Tunis or Egypt, which is why the Arab Spring manifested differently here. So to look at this fragmentation specifically among the opposition, you can look at it on four major categories. First would be those who support religious government versus secular government. Again, all of these are categories, and within them there's a spectrum of allegiance to one side or the other. It's not black and white. Second, there's the religious divide between Sunni Islam and Shia, Alawite, Christian, honestly, any other religious minority that has received and enjoyed protection in the Assad regime that they might not enjoy otherwise. There's the ethnic racial divide between Kurdish and Arabs. And then finally, there's the socioeconomic divide in Syria between those in the rural communities and those in urban communities. An example of how these fragmented groups might try to overcome the issues from fragmentation is seen in Jaish al-Fatah, which is an umbrella group which includes Jabhat al-Nusra and then Ahrar al-Sham. Both of those are theocratic, seeking jihadist groups. But Jaish al-Fatah also includes some more moderate groups that are a part of it because they're Sunni, but they might be more comfortable with a secular government rather than a theocratic regime. So even within one organization, we see that co-members are working at cross purposes from each other, leading to deeper fragmentation within the society as well as within the opposition. Another thing that kind of sets Syria apart is the way that Bashar al-Assad structured his government. He inherited this government from his father, Hafez al-Assad, who staged the final coup in a revolving door of coups in the 1970s. Because of this, Assad's government has already been structured to be wary of traitors and those who might act against the regime. So in short, Assad has been looking for a coup since before the uprising ever started. An example of this is the Mukhabarat, which is the security elite intelligence fighting force. There are 15 divisions, and each division is tasked with specific tasks regarding the population, but also tasked with spying on the other divisions. So any traitors or those who might be dissenters with the regime were being persecuted long before the uprising ever began. There's also this idea for Bashar al-Assad that his regime is more than just a regime. It is a legacy passed down from his father. And he would rather be the king of nothing than have to surrender that legacy that has been left to him. It was said that he would rather rule rubble than not rule at all. So when he's assessing the costs of the civil war, abdication of the throne is not an option to him. So the second reason why it got so bad was the involvement of international actors. Assad is different from any of the other rulers in the Arab Spring in that he could not ever be isolated. He had a relationship with Russia and a relationship with Iran that was cemented by their desires to have regional influence. So Russia specifically is a member of the United Nations Security Council and was able to block any potentially helpful or effective resolutions coming from the UNSC, while Iran has a more regional role and is able to be ground forces and aid military strength training and leadership to Assad whenever he needs it. These two have a commitment to Assad that extends outside of what anybody expected. So at the beginning of the conflict, there was also this role for other regional actors such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. These actors were encouraging the opposition to escalate the situation to a civil war, and did so with the promise of the US will step in, the US is coming, or the West is coming, something along those lines that gave the opposition hope that they would be supplemented, they would be helped by an outside power, as we saw in Libya. However, in August 2011, Obama made the declaration that Assad needed to step down. This was taken as a command, and it had two adverse purposes in that one, it solidified Russia and Iran's commitment because now they weren't only supporting Assad against regional actors, they were actively going against what the US wanted, and that was an incentive to continue on. Second, it confirmed the promises of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey to the opposition and had the opposition entrench themselves more in what they were already doing. It is also important to note that Saudi Arabia and Qatar had constant, have a history of having an animosity in their relationship. So they were not able to overcome that. And ultimately, the costs of being involved in the war overwhelmed their perceived benefits. So they eventually had to step out. Turkey persisted because Turkey was continually the recipient of waves of refugees, lack of help from Europe, lack of help from the US, and had no choice but to continue to try and work on the Syrian conflict. Turkey and Russia are an example of how international actors were not able to set aside their outside relationship to work on or commit to their position in the Syrian civil war. Turkey and Russia continued a détente and even renewed it and initiated a new one in 2016, which led to Turkey sacrificing the rebel stronghold in Aleppo in order to attack the Kurdish peoples who were also working for the opposition. So that's a situation in which the opposition attacked another part of the opposition. The United States under Obama and Trump, since they were the two leaders during this conflict, essentially had very similar policies in that it was very cautious. The only real difference is that Trump was willing to work with Russia, although not Iran, where Obama was not as concerned with creating a working relationship with Russia as President Trump was. So if we're looking at who had the heaviest hand internationally, it would be Russia and Iran. It's important to note, though, they didn't provide enough assistance to actually end the war. They just provided enough assistance to continue the war. Finally, the Islamic State was an intervention of a radical opponent. It is important to note that they had no interest in seeing Assad fall for Assad's crimes. Their interest was in establishing the caliphate as a global call to Muslims. Because the Islamic State was a global threat, it garnered global attention, and it took away resources, it took away attention and media coverage from the Syrian civil war, and also acted as a belligerent in the Syrian civil war because it was actively trying to take the same territory that was being fought over by the opposition and the regime. So the Islamic State created that issue for the opposition and that they were underfunded and not as organized. But they also created an excuse for both sides to completely ignore ceasefires because they could justify firing on the Islamic State, which was not protected by ceasefires. So ultimately, if you look at how the Syrian civil war has gone, who won, it is hard to say that anybody did. Even though Assad remains in power, he is in power over nothing. A country that has been completely devastated into a shadow of its former self. No international actor has gotten what they wanted, and many have created more issues for them outside of this issue. So a more effective question would be who lost the least and who lost the most? And for who lost the most, the answer has to be the Syrian people, because they've lost their nation, their stability, and many of their international connections. Thank you.